Hi there, English 202. So in addition to today's reading on 20th and 21st century from your textbook, I just want to give you an additional lecture to help you understand modernism and postmodernism, and especially the idea of structuralism, which was an idea that appeared during the modernist period. So first of all, just briefly, what is modernism? It took its cues from the aesthetic movement at the end of the 19th century. All right, so the idea of art for art's sakes, which was an idea that Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater promoted, was replaced by make it new. That's during the modernist period, especially during the 1920s and 1930s. World War I obviously had a tremendous influence on the aesthetic and moral sensibilities of the period. All right, the idea that the Enlightenment, of course, prioritized rationality and reason. We talked about that at the very beginning of the semester. Well, modernism called that into question. What had reason led us to? Well, reason led us to mustard gas, had led us to machine guns, had led us to bombs dropping from airplanes. All right, so all those ideas of the Enlightenment were really called into question. The novel, as a literary genre, overtook poetry for the most part, not entirely, as the dominant form of literary expression. So some of the major novelists, James Joyce, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, and D.H. Lawrence, were bestsellers throughout this period. I especially recommend reading James Joyce, A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and then following that up with James Joyce's Ulysses. Ulysses is typically regarded as the best novel ever written. It is difficult, but it is a tour de force, a very, very interesting novel. So Cubism, Impressionism, and experimentation were influential aesthetic movements during this period. If you look at the middle of your textbook, you'll see some instances of artwork that for each period, the Romantics, Victorians, and the Modernists. You'll see the Cubism of Van Gogh, right? So stuff like that, which was quite popular during this time, especially during the French Impressionists and Cubists. And of course, from Sigmund Freud, who postulated the idea that consciousness is kind of like a stream, and from from William James, who also postulated the same idea, stream of consciousness became a new narrative style. So stream of consciousness makes the narrative a little more difficult to understand because you're not sure if the reader or if the character is thinking what's on the page or if he or she's actually speaking what's on the page. There's kind of a blurring of the boundaries between the inside and the outside of the character's mind and speech. So modernism and structuralism. Structuralism is an idea or a critical theory that appeared during the modernist period. It emerged from anthropology, sociology, psychology, and literary criticism. All right, it especially emerged from semiotics, the idea of study of language. All right. Structuralism is a theory of human experience, all right, that includes culture, ideology, and literature. And it's reducible to signs and sign systems. Now, we talked about signs, maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago, all right? So culture, loosely defined, is nothing more than a structure of signs and sign systems. We don't speak language. Language speaks us. So for structuralists, everything that communicates a meaning, such as a handshake, a Coke bottle, a stop sign, belongs to a system of signification and is thus an important element that helps us better understand human experience. Okay? Structuralists want to demonstrate that rather than thinking of signs as natural or as given prior to human experience, signs are actually arbitrary and that their meaning is a construct of human conventions that occur over time. So for example, there is no inherent reason why a stop sign means we should stop. Rather, its meaning emerges because a stop sign belongs to a larger system of signs, such as it's not red, or it's red and not green. It says stop and not go, all right? We talked about this when we discussed what a sign is. It's a signifier and a signified. Specific cultural elements are tied to larger structural systems, such as myths, religions, rituals, and stories. So structuralism was a useful way to understand how literary text operates within a larger linguistic or sign system. This is true especially if we consider how any work of literature is, in essence, a collection of signs or words, right, that operate within a larger system, such as a sentence, which belongs to a larger system yet, the book. So in this sense, structuralism provides literary theorists with a method for breaking down large sign systems, such as a myth, and seeing how the structure of each myth corresponds to other myths from different cultures and historical periods. So understood this way, each book we read, each sign we encounter, belongs to a larger network of signs and sign systems, all of which are meaningful only by way of cultural conventions and historical context. It's a very interesting theory. Postmodernism emerged in the 1960s and early 1970s, and it challenged some of the ideas of modernism. So some of the differences from modernism. Whereas modernism was a structure or was closed, right, in its own kind of structuralism, postmodernism is open, it's anti-form. Whereas modernism declared a purpose, postmodernism thinks about play, that signs aren't necessarily structured, but they rely on other signs for their meaning, but that sign can never be stable. All right, so stop relies on go, relies on stop, relies on go. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. There is no stability. Whereas modernism focused on design, postmodern focuses on chance. Modernism looks at the finished work, the process, the becoming. Postmodernism works on dispersal and other things. Where modernism focuses on centering and genre and boundary, postmodern looks at text and intertextuality. And where modernism thinks about root and depths, postmodernism thinks about rhizomes or surfaces. Okay? So some of the important theorists in the postmodern period, most of them come from France. And the first one is Jean-Francois Lyotard. He focused on computer networks. And he says, no knowledge will survive that cannot be translated into a computer language. And this is from the 1970s. Very interesting ideas. He says that wars will eventually be over information, not about territories. Think about cyber war, for example. The fall of grand narratives, such as origin stories and myths. The advent of micro-narratives instead. Personal stories, news feeds, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So the idea of origin stories, the Bible, and myths that, from Native American myths aren't going to be as important anymore. It's all about the personal story, all right? And we see this today. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are celebrated more than origin stories of a culture. And the origin stories were what structuralists focused on. Postmodernists or post-structuralists focus on the micro-narratives. Another interesting theorist was Frederick Jameson. He focused mainly on capitalism, all right? He came to the idea that the 1700s to the 1850s was market capitalism, industrial capitalism accumulated in national markets. He then says during the late 19th and early 20th century, national markets expanded to world markets, depends on raw materials and cheap labor. Postmodern capitalism, on the other hand, is unrestricted growth of multinational corporations such as Coca-Cola. It invades nature by destroying pre-capitalistic forms of agriculture and invades the unconscious through advertising. And this is a really interesting idea, how advertising works at the unconscious level. So Frederick Jameson uses Sigmund Freud's idea of the unconscious and applies capitalist ideas to understand how consciousness works through capitalism, or how capitalism works through consciousness. Very interesting. The last theorist is Jean Bullard. He's concerned with mass communication and the simulacra. If you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, a lot of his ideas appear in The Matrix. He says there are no originals of anything. There's only copies, models, and codes. We live in a system of meaning that's modeled on a computer code, ones and zeros or binaries. We have the choice, Pepsi or Coke, Democrat, Republican. And this choice seems to give us freedom, but it only perpetuates the binary code itself. So meaning itself, the system of meanings or signs are based on binary codes, kind of like computer language. Today, he says, icons and copies or simulations bear no resemblance to reality. The simulation becomes the real, or what he calls hyper-reality. And let's just think of a quick example. I can go on Google Maps and focus directly on, say, the city of Paris. I can walk the city of Paris. walk down the streets and have it simulated on my computer screen. All right, so what he's basically saying is that it doesn't even matter if the original exists anymore. Paris itself could disappear or be blown up by a nuclear bomb. We still have the simulation on the computer. I can still visit Paris. I never have to visit Paris in the real world when I can always just visit it through my computer. So the representation of what something should look like is created by the simulacra, or he calls ads, images, social media, films, etc. So we base our life not necessarily on what is real, but rather on the representation of what reality should be. So our life is often compared to ads, images on social media, such as on Instagram. All right, we fear of missing out. All that idea comes from social media, and our life, in a sense, models itself on what life should look like on Facebook or Instagram. Some people long for the real, but that can never again be realized. It's nostalgia. Again, the idea of making America great again, we long for a real America. But that is impossible, according to Jean Bullard. It's always going to be a representation. So in a way, life becomes TV, and TV becomes life. TV, he says, watches us, and we watch TV watching over us. And that, for example, is YouTube. So I hope you understand some of the concepts of modernism, structuralism, and postmodernism or post-structuralism. These are very interesting concepts, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to help out.